Hello everyone, and we are here in Yorba, California on this wonderful sunny afternoon for the supposed burial site of the 37th President of the United States, Richard Milhouse Nixon, the man himself. Well, Nixon was President of the United States for a term and a half, from 1969 to 1974. Now, as you guys know, Richard Nixon is the only president in American history to resign office. No other president has gave up his position besides Richard Nixon. And that had to do with the Watergate scandal of the early 1970s.
Maybe this fountain's tribute to Watergate.
The Watergate. We're gonna go try to find the grave of Nixon. He was born on January 9th of 1913. His ancestors were actually from Ohio, but his father moved the family to California. His great-grandfather actually died at Gettysburg. He was fought at Gettysburg. George Nixon. Here's his library. We can't go in and film because they don't let you film at these places. And he died, Nixon just died in April of 1994. He was 81 years old. He actually died in Manhattan, but they took his body back to California because he lived here in this area. Actually, he was born here. He's actually buried on the site of his birth. So his birthplace is also his burial site, which is pretty interesting. So we're going to check out his birthplace and burial site down here, and obviously, tradition, we are going to be screaming Richard Nixon for smash. Nixon deserves it. My fourth great-grandfather actually fought with Nixon's great-grandfather at Gettysburg during the Civil War. They were in the same regiment. My fourth great-grandfather and Richard Nixon's great-grandfather were in the same Ohio regiment during the Civil War, which is pretty interesting. His grandfather, I think, died in 1914, and he was born in 1913, which was the year before, so you probably didn't remember. There's the seal. There's Richard Nixon Presidential Library in the Birthplace. Now, Nixon usually gets a lot of crap by historians. Most people think he was kind of one of the weaker presidents, but he had a lot of scandals and things like that. Keeping the U.S. involved in the Vietnam War. This might be his burial site. Admission to see his grave, and you can only see it during certain hours. One, the library's open like 10 to 5, so it's like 4:30 right now, so we're like really close. What I was saying is Richard Nixon holds the distinction of being the only person in the 20th century to go through 5. He went through the most presidential conventions of any president in the United States, the Republican conventions. He went through 5 of them because he was vice president with Dwight D. Eisenhower for 2 terms, and then he ran for president in 1960 against John F. Kennedy, a very close race for president. The very first presidential debate ever on live television was the 1960 debate between Kennedy and Nixon. Nixon narrowly lost the 1960 election. And then in 1968, he ran for president, won against incumbent Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and then he won again in 1972. Although 2 years later, he did resign the office. Vice President at the time, Gerald Ford, took over. Nixon was indeed not a crook.
And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
President?
Yes, sir.
I am not a crook. I've earned everything I've got. The Pat Nixon Rose Garden, January 3rd of 2010. Not sure when Pat Nixon died, but that was First Lady. Nixon died, like I said, 1994. Born in 1913. Yeah. Let's check out the birthplace before we do the screen. So there's the gravestones of Pat and Richard Nixon. So here's the Richard Nixon birthplace. So we're just going to read this right here. So I was born in a house my father built, President Richard Nixon. In 1912, Frank and Hannah Nixon, Nixon's parents, in 1912, built this modest farmhouse on their small citrus ranch. Here, Richard Nixon was born on the 9th of January, 1913. Spent his first 9 years in this house. He served his country as a congressman, U.S. Senator, Vice President, and 37th President of the United States from 1969 to 1974. And he was the first native-born Californian to hold the presidency. President Nixon achieved significant advances in international diplomacy by ending the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, opening lines of communication with China and the Soviet Union, and initiating the Middle East peace process. So, birthplace of Richard Milhouse Nixon. Build a great nation. Birthplace of Nixon. Yep. Huh, interesting. The tree's cool. Let's give you the screen. Oh, that's Lincoln. Lincoln's down here. As you know, Nixon was the only president to resign due to what was known as the Watergate scandal. For those of you that don't know what that is, basically, during the 1972 election, Richard Nixon's entire administration was accused of spying on the Democratic Party during that election, causing corruption in the candidacy. And it was a huge scandal, and it caused Richard Nixon's previous vice president, Spiro Agnew, to resign in 1973. And then Nixon appointed Ford to be his vice president in the following year. Nixon resigned. There we go. Richard Nixon versus Smash! Let's go. The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of Peacemaker. In Smash Bros. He died 5 years before Smash Bros. And here's Patricia Ryan Nixon, First Lady, 1912 to 1993. What's interesting about their birth and death years is Patricia was born the year before him and died the year before him. So pretty cool. Richard Nixon. So he started his life here, and he lays at rest eternally right here. But Nixon was a very prestigious man, very prestigious politician. He had held many positions throughout his time in politics.
It's a pretty modest grave.
Pretty modest gravestone. Nixon is one of the presidents of the modern times. He died in 1994. Most presidents nowadays are buried on the grounds of their presidential libraries. Nixon is no exception. Look at these palm trees, they're very beautiful. Alright guys, that's going to conclude the burial site for President Richard Nixon. Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to comment, like, subscribe. We'll see you guys next time. Goodbye. Whack!